But can you hear me yet?
I can hear you, Charlie.
Great. Nobody else there yet?
Paul's here. I think he just went to the men's room. And Kim's
Okay,
here.
no Kim?
Yes, Kim's
Good.
Kim was here when I got here, which was like a half an hour ago. So, good time to catch up on emails and stuff.
It is. I know Mr. Lee is going to be about 30 minutes late. He came across a rollover accident, so he had to stop. Something about his job.
Yeah, it goes with the territory.
Yeah. So, no members of the public?
Oh, yeah, we have 2 members of the public already.
Good. I'm all by my lonesome down here.
Is that good or bad?
I don't know.
Ask you later.
Yeah. Does Kim know if Jonathan is going to go to the room in Elko?
Yes, to my understanding, he is.
Thank you. So Kim, do you know how does it work if somebody wants to watch this on the internet?
I do not know how that works if somebody wants to watch it on the internet.
Hey, Charlie, I bet I can help you. If they want to watch it on the internet, they go to the legislative website, look under meetings on the right-hand side, and if it's an active meeting, once the meeting starts, they should be able to view it on the internet.
Aha, thank you.
I got
Good morning.
educated at publications last week.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'll be right back.
back. So Kim, I typed in Nevada legislature meetings and sure enough it's there. So I wonder in the future when we publicize meetings on the web, if we should give them that link as well. Might ask the chairman what he thinks about that.
I agree. I sort of heard most of the conversation, but I know what you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good idea.
I can do that for the future postings and meetings.
I don't think they can participate. It's not like it's a public. They can just watch us, I think.
That's correct. That's correct.
One of the things that
And it's delayed.
one of the things we could think about is people being able to email public comment in if they're watching it on the internet, then they can write an email, and then that can be read into public comment at the end. In the last public comment. And what do you think of that?
Well, I think that might work.
All right.
It's listening to it here. It's quite delayed, but that would work at the end.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, it would be sort of the final comment, and then if the chair chooses to take comment during a specific agenda item, the chair could turn around and say, well, okay, we're going to wait for email things to come in, and then go from there. And we can bring it up at the next meeting. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a reasonable idea.
Yeah.
All right.
Trying to be more transparent like we are, it's just about, people can watch us from their desktops. Good morning, Mr. Griggs. Can you hear us?
Hey, good morning, Charlie. I can. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Before you walked in, I was explaining that Mr. Lee came across a rollover accident on his way in, so he's going to be about 30, 40 minutes delayed.
Oh, good gosh. Well, hope it comes out all right.
Yeah, he said the ambulance had just arrived, so I didn't ask him any more than that. So I have 8:59. We're getting close. I have no public down here. Has the public signed in up there?
Yes, they
No
have.
public here.
Well, I think I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order if everyone's ready. And do you have a flag up there in your room?
No,
Reno,
don't have one.
Is there a flag in Reno? Or in Carson, I mean?
There is.
Then we probably should stand and say the pledge.
I pledge
Pledge allegiance
to the flag
Allegiance to the flag
United States
of the United
of the
States
United States of America,
to the republic for which
to
it
the republic for which it stands,
stands,
one
one
nation,
nation, under God, indivisible,
indivisible,
liberty and justice for all.
liberty and justice for all.
All right. Well, good morning, all. Kim, could you do the roll call, please?
Commissioner Cox,
Present.
Commissioner Elmore, Commissioner Giroux, Commissioner Griggs,
Good morning.
Commissioner Jackson,
Present, but I'm not a member of the committee.
Commissioner Lambert,
Present.
Commissioner Lee, Commissioner Richardson, Commissioner Baker, and Commissioner McKay.
Present.
So, Kim, I guess we didn't tell you, the members of this committee are myself, Commissioner Lee, Commissioner Griggs, Commissioner Lambert, and Commissioner McKay. So out of those commissioners, I believe we have a quorum. Okay.
We have a quorum.
Okay. So before we do public comment, I think it would be a good idea, since we're really trying to be as transparent as we can, is for each of the commissioners to say what clubs or activities or how they're involved. You know, we are going to be making regulations, hopefully, here, a time-consuming process. And so the members of the public know, you know, one of the qualifications just to be appointed to this commission was we had to be active in the areas that we represent. So just so everyone knows, I'm the president of the Mesquite ATV Club and a member of the Las Vegas ATV Club. And I think, Mr. Griggs, would you like to, are you involved in?
Good morning, John Griggs, and I'm not a member of any OHV or ATV club. I'm a member of the Nevada Cattlemen's Association, and I'm the rancher representative on the commission. I'm here because Nevada Cattlemen's Association believes in the multiple use concept on public lands, and we know that we have a lot in common with OHV users, and if we don't hang together, we'll hang separately.
Thank you. Mr. Lambert or Mr. McKay?
For the record, Commissioner McKay, I'm the current president of the Tahoe Sierra Snowmobiling Club.
Gary Lambert. I hold no positions in clubs to date. I am a member of the Dust Devils Motorcycle Club.
Thank you. Okay, public comment. As I said, there's no public in Las Vegas. I don't believe there's any in Elko. So are there members of the public in Carson who would like to address the committee?
They're coming up, Charlie.
Thank you.
Larry Calkins from the Nevada Four-Wheel Drive Association, and this is just to submit a letter that was sent to all the commissioners yesterday regarding suggestions in the adoption of the new regulations, and I just will submit the letter to the Secretary for the record.
Thank you. I believe we did receive that letter. In my hope, one of the processes we have to go through in this, Larry, is to have a public workshop. And so if it's all right with you, I'd like to wait and address those concerns of yours during that workshop, because I think that today's meeting is going to be rather lengthy.
The only reason for the submission of it here in the beginning of this regulation development is so that that's in the mind of the commissioners as they develop it, instead of waiting for a workshop and trying to insert these ideas after the fact.
All right, I appreciate that. We hope to have the workshop here within the next couple of weeks, so it will be within the fact, but maybe we can go through it today then.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other members of the public in Carson?
Yes, Doug Holcomb will be up in just a second.
Hello, my name is Doug Holcomb. I'm the president of the Pine Nut Mountains Trail Association. I also have some thoughts and ideas on the commission committee ideas. And again, agreeing with Larry Calkins, I think it's important to have these thoughts out prior to the commission's or the committee's workshops. I thank you for your continued efforts to have a well-run commission. Formulating and adhering to an open and consistent set of regulations and guidelines are very important components to a successful program. I understand and appreciate that this is the beginning of a process and that these are just ideas. Please take my thoughts into consideration. Under the eligible applicants, number 5, I believe that if there is grant money available and an applicant has more than one worthwhile project, I see no reason to not award more than one per grant cycle. A second grant might be considered only after all other grants are awarded. On number 6 for eligible applicants, to me this seems over-limiting. Grantee may have 2 completely different projects. Such as a 2-year trail building project and possibly an educational project for the next year. Under the general guidelines and rules, number 4, unless written that the landowner/agency will assume continued operation and maintenance. I apologize to you that are not in Carson City. I brought copies for the committee members here. But I can email these to you. I was kind of a time crunch the last day or so. Under the general guidelines and rules, number 7, I believe that a numerical scoring component is very important in the awards process as it adds consistency and transparency. It need not be the final determination, but should be a significant component. Under the general guidelines and rules, considering number 10 and number 11, number 11 makes no sense, or part of number 11 makes no sense to me, that an officer in a group, in a OHV or other group, should be treated any differently than any other volunteer. I believe the commissioner should be applauded for being a part of the local OHV system as well as being a state representative. I do agree that said commissioner should not vote on the grant application that they are involved in, but they should definitely be a part of the discussion. Under general guidelines and rules, number 15, I think that the words may should be changed to will. I believe that the written guidelines are very important for the public to follow and in the interest of consistency and transparency. Number 17, under the general guidelines and rules, the commission should not set any rules or requirements as it feels necessary as a condition of funding unless those rules or requirements are written in the guidelines and known to all applications. Again, there needs to be consistency and transparency. Further on, in the non-eligible costs, under flyers, brochures, and publications and printing, flyers, brochures, publications, and printing costs can make up the majority portion of an education program. And under grant awards, disbursements of funds, reimbursement-only funding severely limits the ability of smaller grassroots groups with limited budgets, such as the Pine Nuts Mountain Trail Association. It severely limits these groups to receive grants. The Commission should allow for pre-funding projects to worthy grant applicants for worthy projects. Thank you.
Chair,
Thank you.
I have a couple of quick questions. Would it be okay if I ask them?
Sure.
All right. Mr. Holcomb, going to the small, large, and medium-sized grants, the kind of grants that you're talking about for your club, would they fall within the small grant? Would they be under $25,000?
Just a moment, let me find that page.
Well, basically, there's small grants, large grants, and medium grants. Small grants are under $25,000. Are the kind of grants you'll be looking for under?
Most likely, yeah.
All right.
You know, I can't say what the future would bring, but at this point in time, I would think most likely.
All right. The other thing, how is your club set up? Are you set up as a 501 or?
We are not a 501. We are a Nevada nonprofit.
Right.
And that was another thing, and I might have forgot to write that down, but when you and in the ideas, it was written nonprofit a couple of times, and I was concerned whether that meant 501 nonprofit or whether that meant Nevada Nonprofit Corporation.
The candid answer to that is we haven't decided. All right, thank you.
Yeah, again, my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else up there that wants to come forward?
Good morning. This is Scott Gers with the Nevada Trail Stewards. I would like to echo the efforts and applaud the efforts from the Nevada Four-Wheel Drive Association and the Pine Nut Mountains and not repeat their efforts that they've put into this very lengthy regulatory process. And I'm looking forward to working with the Commission and getting a nice set grant process in order here. Thanks for working with us.
Thank you. I'm at a little disadvantage down here. I can't always see what's going on in the room, so I need to keep asking if there's anyone else in the public that has a comment?
I think that's it at this time, Charlie.
Okay. Then moving forward, I guess I'd kind of like to open it up to the commissioners to see what their thoughts on some of these, just go through page by page. I really don't want to do every single line item if we don't need to, but I'm sure you guys have some thoughts, so I don't really know who to start with. It doesn't really matter. I think just say what you have on your mind.
Charlie, John Griggs.
John?
First off, Charlie, there's a lot of work here you've done, and I appreciate that very much. I would suggest that maybe we bite off what you've done section by section and talk about each section, hammer out a section before we continue.
Okay. Any other thoughts from?
Charlie, this is Gary Lambert for the record.
Yes?
I think it might be appropriate to go right through the actual agenda and hit these items one at a time. They all need to be addressed, and it's not a small task, but we're a couple of years late starting, so we need to get it done. So I do encourage us to go line item by line item. Thank you.
Well, the way I read the agenda, it's just an explanation of all the different things we're going to cover. So I like the idea of going section by section. So let's just start with the eligible grants section. I actually had a thought on line 7 there, knowing that it could be a problem that people keep getting grants and never successfully complete the work. We want to be cognizant of that, but then there might be a legitimate reason, especially in a construction project or something in the future. And so I guess I was looking for an idea there as to what process we can use to let somebody extend the length of time that they would need to do a project.
Paul Jackson for the record. One of the things we could do is add into that the line may be waived with a 2/3 majority vote of the commission. So if somebody comes to us and they've got a project in the works and it's either needs to take a little bit longer or they want to put a second project in, if there's a compelling reason and the commission feels there's a compelling reason, that we could basically, with a 2/3 majority vote, waive that provision. But still keep the provision in there as a general rule of thumb. But again, if there is a compelling reason, and 2/3 of the commission feel there's a compelling reason, then we could waive it.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other thoughts under this section, eligible applicants?
Yeah, Charlie.
I've got a couple. Sorry.
Go ahead, Mr.
Okay,
Griggs.
John.
I'll go after you.
Okay, thank you, John Griggs. Number 3, to me, it's a small community, and to me, up front, we probably shouldn't limit number of applications per individuals. I would add to number 3, or demonstrate the ability to complete multiple grants in the timeline provided.
So you're advocating that if just an individual wants to come forward and do a project, that would be all right, provided they could prove they could do it acceptably, without them being a nonprofit of any kind. Well, see, if they were a nonprofit, they would have to have some kind of officers.
to me, if a single individual brings forth a good project and the commission agrees that it's a good project that will benefit the OHV community, we shouldn't disallow them to do it just because they're a single individual and not tied to a club.
Okay.
Charlie?
Yes?
Gary Lambert for the record. I believe that we should get back to the agenda item so that we cover every item, and we should take a close look at the actual scoring guidebook. We spent a great deal of time during the grant committee at deciding that we should not limit who was able to apply, and indeed persons and individuals were able to apply within the guidebook. I'm very concerned that we're going to go off of these regulation ideas and leave items out that are on the agenda that was provided and worked on by the AG. It would be appropriate to run off of the agenda to comply with the open meeting law. I'm concerned.
So agenda item 1, regulations committee discussed development regulations, rulemaking processes. That's what we're doing. We're discussing the rulemaking process.
I understand, and you've referred several times to a grant regulation sheet that has not been subject to open meeting. I'm not picking on you, Charlie. I'm just telling you that it seems uncomfortable that we're working off a regulation sheet that had never been agendized and brought forward to the public in time. Go ahead.
This is simply a handout that was prepared for the public that's been available online and for the public now. It's just a starting point. Rather than having to sit here and think up of all these different things, this is simply a starting point. That there's nothing, no decision's been made on any of this, and won't be until after a workshop.
I totally understand that, Charlie. All I'm concerned about is, does this draft that you've worked on cover every item in the agenda, and do they follow the guide for the agenda?
Well, when I was reviewing the agenda, I thought that it did. Did you see some area in there that is there an area in the agenda that you think is not covered by this ideas?
I'm not sure. I was just asking to bring it to your attention, Charlie. You're the chair. I'm really not trying to push you into anything. I'm just concerned. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, thank you. I believe Mr. McKay had some comments on eligible applicants.
Yes, Charlie, and I want to thank you for your previous efforts on this. And it goes back to number 1 on your idea list there, and it would be in 5B on the agenda that local, county, state, federal, recreation, metro districts, and nonprofit organizations. I just want to make sure that Nevada OHV clubs that are properly registered and recognized in the state are able to apply for grants, assuming they have the proper paperwork.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
I think we all would agree with that.
Okay.
And I don't know, and as we go through here, but that's a good point, because as we go through here, we may have to discuss what types of paperwork we're going to need to see in the future. So it's something to keep in mind.
Chair?
Yes, sir?
Paul Jackson for the record. I think that we do need to clean up number 2 because there seems to be a conflict. Number 1, we put local, county, state governments, federal agencies and all of this kind of good stuff. The number 2 sort of almost contradicts that, so it would be good to clean that up and maybe just use the word municipality and then clubs, and there may be a need for accredited academic organizations such as, say, a university, which may do an EPA study or may do a study on sage grouse, which are probably going to be important studies coming up. So I would like to include those. The other point, and I don't know if this is the right point to bring this up, but I'm thinking that we may want to, with clubs and organizations, for medium and large grants. So that would be grants that were not under 25,000, that those be 501s, either 501c3s or 501c4s. I had a quick word with our advisor from the BLM, and he's double checking whether or not it is a requirement by BLM to be a 501c3 or a 501c4. So obviously we'll get that information before the workshop, but I'd like to sort of plant that seed that, you know, being a 501c 4, 3, 6 or whatever is appropriate for grants which are over $25,000.
All right.
Commissioner Cox, Commissioner McKay, for the record, are we just having a general discussion right now, or are we going to vote or so on these suggestions, whether or not we want to include them in the session?
I think that we can, at least for right now, we're just having a general discussion. I would be shocked. I mean, at the end of this meeting, we still have to have a workshop, and we still have to have more public comments written and otherwise. So I think until we get all of those and really combine everything together, there's nothing that we could vote on to present to the full commission at our next meeting. Maybe after we have a workshop we'd be that far along, but I think today, unless there's something particular that you want to exactly get down, I think now it's a good time for a general discussion and just to rework this, so to speak, and then send it out again and make sure that everything gets put in here that we want.
Chair Paul Jackson, for the record.
Yes.
It may be a good idea, unless there's something glaring that we need to change, and I don't see anything. It may be just a good idea to go through this for the record and then vote to move it forward to the workshop. And that way, at the workshop, we can do any and all changes, because obviously the public can participate at that point, or can participate easily at that point.
Easily, huh? Well, that's a good idea. So, but let's see if we can keep working through it, and then just at the end, just take it as a complete, with the changes written down that we have made or that have been suggested. So is there any other thing that we think under the eligible applicant sections that we should consider?
Charlie, John Griggs.
Yes.
I think under number 6, I think especially up front, it's going to be hard to limit grants or to one grant per applicant. I think that we should either delete number 6 or have them prioritize multiple grants and show the ability to complete all awarded grants in the timeline provided.
Chair?
Yes, sir.
This is Gary Lambert, for the record. I agree wholeheartedly with Charlie. If you look at these, or with John Griggs, excuse me, if you look at all of the different states that I've availed this, there are repeated people that do a lot of work and need a fair amount of money, and there are other people that don't ever apply and clubs that don't apply. That's inappropriate language. I would agree to strike it and number 3 both.
Chair?
All right, well, yes, sir.
Paul Jackson, for the record. I have seen this in other language from other states several times, but reversed, whereas we can only do 1 grant per project. So, in other words, if 2 entities come in and want to do work on Hunter Lake Road, then we would only grant 1 of them, we wouldn't grant 2 of them. So, for example, if somebody's using matching funds, they can't use our funds to match our funds. But I've seen that way in other states' regulations.
Okay.
Charlie, I stand by striking it, Gary Lambert, and I'd be very curious as to what states we're speaking of that have that other clause. I'm not aware of it myself.
I believe it's Idaho as one of them, and I can get that information for you from
All right.
the gentleman that used to be
Well, I don't-
occupying the position.
Well, for
I
just
guess I don't
for
I don't
discussion,
agree
I
with
think that
striking it.
striking it makes sense, as a couple of us suggested it, and that can be one of the options. We can keep moving.
Okay. Yeah, I like Mr. Griggs's idea. Maybe somehow. Well, I guess if you strike it, then they could be more than one applicant anyway. So.
Yep.
All right. Let's keep moving. Okay, so under general guidelines, are we ready to go there? General guidelines and rules?
Excuse me.
I've got,
Go ahead, John.
thank you, Gary. John Griggs, number 1 kind of conflicts a little bit to my mind with number 8 above, in that, Nevada's 87% public land. We need to say that in number 1 that either this paragraph or they are number 8 above. Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense to some degree, but we have had situations that somebody is looking for a grant for a specific project on a piece of property that they don't either have management responsibilities over or a lease enacted, in hand when they apply for the grant. And I think they just need to have something in hand, not saying, well, we think we're going to get a lease, and then we give the money and they don't get the lease for some reason. Then what do we do? So I think that was more for, once you have everything in hand, then come to us for a grant.
I absolutely agree with that, Charlie. The thing I'm saying is that you can't have any of that for public land. So this paragraph in number 1, you could add at the end, or have approval from the federal land manager, appropriate federal land management agency.
Chair, may I interject? This is Paul Jackson for the record. May I interject? We could resolve that just by making it clear that this is for private property. So we can put something in the language that says for projects on private property, and then continue with item number 1.
Yeah, that's good.
That would work, yes. Okay.
Charlie, on number...
Mr. Griggs,
Go ahead.
go ahead.
For me, Charlie? Or for
Yes,
Mr. Griggs?
yes, Mr. Lambert.
Thank
No,
you,
Mr.
Charlie.
Lambert.
Gary Lambert for the record. On number 7 line item, in construction, you would generally use the term substantial completion because there are often cleanup items and punch list items. I'm really not very comfortable with item 7 in general, but if any part of it were to stay, it would need to be substantial completion, not completion.
Okay, good idea. But item number 7 in which, in general rules and
Eligibility.
guidelines?
No, back under eligibility.
Oh, back under eligibility. Okay.
Charlie, John Griggs.
Yes.
So number 6, under general guidelines and rules, we say that an EA has to be done within 90 days. That might not be possible.
It's not.
Those things can take forever. I think 6 months is reasonable, I think.
I'm looking at our advisor from the BLM, and he's not believing 6 months is doable in the current government world. He's shaking his head, good luck.
Yeah, and this
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
that one came from Colorado, and that's what they use. I wonder if we need to have any NEPA or environmental analysis done complete before they apply for a grant then?
Charlie, for the record, that's very common.
Yeah.
To be able to only apply for on-the-ground projects when NEPA's through. We had earlier discussed being able to apply for money to get NEPA done because that avails of many partner grant programs. So it's important that we're able to fund NEPA, and it's important that our on-the-ground projects have NEPA done before they're funded. That's the correct route in my mind, as Leo Drum is shaking his head up and down and holding his thumb in the air. That's the correct method.
All right, I would agree with that. Any objections to that?
None.
Okay.
I think that sounds good.
Let's keep moving then through this section. Let me go back.
So, John Griggs, Charlie?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. No. So number 7 talks about the scoring sheet. To me, I would change number 7 to read, the full commission deliberation and votes will be the final determination of grants to be awarded. I think you can generalize that statement. To me, I think it's better to generalize that statement.
Paul Jackson, for the record, I would agree wholeheartedly with Mr. Griggs on that.
Gary Lambert, for the record. I strongly disagree. A good grant program should be scored by anyone, and the public should be able to score that grant program. Our own guidelines indicate that the substantial portion of the grant will be graded on the guidelines and the grant scoring. We need to add some scoring and remove some scoring in locations, but this commission in particular got in a great deal of trouble through the footnote on bottom 12 and thinking that no one was watching. The public is watching, and we need to provide a scoring system that they can score, we can score, and if we don't score it similar to them, it becomes evident. I strongly indicate that the scoring system is not only appropriate, but it's in our best interest for the protection of the program.
Paul Jackson, for the record. Go ahead, sir.
I would agree that a scoring system is appropriate, but the public may want to use the scoring system to see how they rank within the scheme of things, but their scores are not counted on how the commission makes a decision. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Lee to the room if you all cannot see him, and have Kim show him as present at this time. Go ahead, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, sir. Paul Jackson, for the record. I think that making the scoring the sole decider or the strongest part of the decider, it can be problematic, as scores can be manipulated. People can do a grant to the score as opposed to the best interests of the OHV community. We should ultimately only have one consideration. Would the project be of benefit to the OHV community, and as a side thing, obviously, to tourism and the economy, but basically, it should only be, is it going to be good for the OHV community? These grants can be manipulated. There are unscrupulous people out there who will try to do that. So I would strongly suggest that we go with Mr. Griggs's idea and do a more general statement, using the scoring as a guideline only.
Charlie, Gary Lambert.
Mr. Chairman, John Griggs.
Let's do Mr. Lambert first.
I would like to read from you the bottom of page 5 of the grant guidebook. The Nevada Commission on Off-Highway Vehicles staff evaluates your project mainly on the criteria score sheet. We went through the entire process as a commission of determining that that was the most transparent means in dealing with these issues. And I again indicate that if we build a correct score sheet, 8th graders should be able to score grants and provide good decisions. And we have proven that absolute power corrupts. So I encourage us to get a correct guidebook and a correct score sheet And we should definitely look at weighting volunteerism, as you've mentioned in your outline, Charlie. It needs points in the score sheet. That way it gets weighted.
Thank you. Mr. Griggs, did you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. John Griggs, Gary, I appreciate your comments. To me, in setting up the grant application, and I wasn't as involved in the scoring process, but the scoring is an important tool to arrive at a determination, but to me it was always just that, in that it was a tool for the commissioners. But the important part of the process, and the reason why the commission is as big and as diverse as it is that deliberation during the meeting, you know, an open public meeting, to arrive at the conclusion that the grant is or isn't to the benefit of the OHV community. I think if you're worried about gaming the system, it's far easier to game a scoring guide than it is to game a commissioner's vote.
For the record, Gary Lambert.
Thank you.
Charlie,
Yes,
I have
Gary.
a statement. For the record, Gary Lambert. On the surface, that appears to be very good thought process, and I do appreciate the way you go at this. The history of the California program is that it was infiltrated by people that weren't OHV people, and once there was a scoring sheet put back in place, suddenly there was $200 million to return to the OHV budgets, along with $56 million that had gone sideways. After several $100,000 and a couple of passes in legislation, they now have a system that relies on a scoring criteria, and that scoring criteria has greatly restored the value and trust of the community and the marketplace. There is no way that we shouldn't be able to write a guidebook that puts all of our objectives and needs into a numerical standard and takes away personal opinions, or in this case, even the ability to plant an innuendo and to taint the audience. It's very, very important that we return to a guidebook that actually determines, so that the public can actually look at it and know if there's members that are participating that aren't in sync with the community that we represent. I totally understand why you think that it should be up to the commission, but I've looked at the history of what's happened in other states and this state. It does not seem probable that in the long term we will have a sustainable program unless we can write a grant guidebook and a score sheet that protects and benefits the users in Nevada. It is not a personal decision as to who gets that money.
Paul Jackson, for the record.
Yes, Paul?
All right. Mr. Lambert referred to a guidebook. That guidebook was thrown out, as was all of our grants and all of those things. So we are starting from scratch, and I know a lot of people did a lot of hard work on that. We have had personal experience, or I should say the commission has had experience going through this process, and hopefully has learned a lot from that. Again, I think that scoring should be used as a guide. Using it as any more than a guide is going to be problematic. Now, maybe later on, as we've gained more and more experience, and that's really what it comes down to, if 2, 3, 5 years from now we have gained experience and we feel that we can put a guide or a scoring system together that is incredibly fair, then great. But at the moment, we just don't know all the questions to ask. So again, I think it has to come down to common sense, and common sense would dictate that good and reasonable people, 11 of us, can come to a consensus and opinion which is correct. Thank you.
Charlie, for the record,
Thank you.
Gary Lambert.
Yes, Gary? Well, let me say
To the
something
best
first.
of my knowledge, can I finish for just 1 second? To the best of my knowledge, we have operated in some violations, but I am unaware of any motion or vote to throw out any of the work that the grant committee or anyone else did. So I think that those statements may be based in some realities, but they're not factual. And I don't want to have the record tainted with things that just aren't true. The reality is the only vote that's been had on this grant book was to pass it. There has not been no vote to rescind all prior actions, and to date, this grant book is an active document to my mind. Although we don't have an Attorney General today, I'm pretty sure that
Well,
this is an active document.
I would agree with you, and I think in the future, this committee and maybe the grant committee are going to have to be combined or work together or something, but that's not on today's agenda.
Charlie,
I do
I
know
just
that
wanted to clarify the statement.
I appreciate that. I do know in Colorado, where I came from, and I actually sat on grant scoring committees, by having a scoring sheet, it did rank everybody in, basically in numerical order, and you started at the top, and you funded that grant, and you worked your way down, and when the money was gone, it was gone, and everyone else that did not score high enough didn't get an opportunity to present or anything. It was pretty hard and fact. So I see the value of a scoring guide, but the thing I think that I've learned over time is that somebody can score good, and then we come to find out that they don't have tenure over the land if it's private land, or they didn't have a management responsibility. And so we just have to have a little common sense and work both ways. So obviously we're going to have to find some wording here that works for both sides. So let's just agree to disagree for now, and hopefully we can get this hammered out at the workshop.
I have a suggestion for you, Mr. Cox.
Uh-huh.
Perhaps we should put some points in for personal preference or things of that nature so that it can be done in the guidebook. I'm not opposed to having a person have some latitude as the commission. Maybe they deserve a 10-point latitude, but that latitude needs to be put into the score sheet. So there's an option, is to leave that latitude and for John and others and myself to have an opinion, but our opinion should not outweigh the score sheet and the criteria. I would encourage us to find a few points for volunteerism and, shall we say, commissioner's preference, but it needs to be done in the score sheet.
Paul Jackson for the record, sir.
Yes.
I think this obviously this whole thing needs to be debated at the public workshop. But I would say one thing in closing: there were grants that scored low in our last process, that when they did the presentation, my opinion changed completely. My opinion of what they could do, when they could do it, changed, and I actually was for a grant. I would have probably scored out of contention otherwise. So again, I think scoring is a good guideline, and I think it's a great idea to evaluate, and it sort of puts everybody on the same playing field. But it doesn't always work. We could have some really good grants slip through the cracks because they didn't score well. So again, that would be my point. But I would also ask that we move on.
Yes. To that point, the commissioners have the opportunity to change their scores during their presentations, because the score sheets aren't turned in until after that first day's presentation. So that would help that situation. If we limit it to the 10-point latitude, well, it doesn't matter. The score sheets are turned in after the first day's presentations. You may come with them filled out to the meeting based on what you've read, but the whole reason for giving people the opportunity to present is to, as you just say, change our minds. So I do agree that a scoring system, we need to have a scoring system, and we just have to find a way to have just a little bit of latitude. So let's go ahead and move on, and that was also addressed here in the Nevada Four-Wheel Drive Association's letter number 7 in this under the grant guidelines. And then they had a question about number 10, what is an advisor, and do we have advisors? And Yes, we do have advisors, and I don't have the list in front of me, but Paul, do you remember? I mean, it's people from the Department of, the BLM, the Department of Wildlife.
Paul Jackson.
There are several advisors, and they're listed in NRS.
Right. Paul Jackson, for the record. I actually had a brief conversation with the author of this letter about advisors and went over it and gave him a chance to ask any questions, and I think they were satisfied with the answer. Is that correct, sir? He's nodding his head yes.
Okay. All right, so then moving on, and I believe we're down to
Charlie, John Griggs.
Yes, sir.
I would just say that if there's any doubt left for anybody out there, that it's defined, our advisors are defined in NRS 490.068.
Yes, thank you. All right, let's see if we can move on. Let's starting with what, line item 10 here in general guidelines and rules. Any thoughts or comments from the finishes, page 10 to 17?
Charlie, John Griggs, should we even mess with any like grammar typos? Should we just skip those for now?
We could. They have to be corrected. I mean, that's a simple correction. Do you have one there?
So you do or do not want to skip?
No, let's correct the grammar if we need to.
Okay, in number 11, it says, will not speak in support for or lobby for in public or private spelled Private. And then commission may imposes, it should be drop the S, impose. And at the end of that sentence, provision, not provisions.
Okay. But, so as pointed out earlier in public comment, there was some concern that a commissioner should be able to speak in favor of a grant, just not vote on it. So do we want to change that wording to reflect that?
I do want to change it so it can reflect that a commissioner can advocate for a grant. We were requested to advocate for grants. I don't like. The big thing is that a commissioner should be able to advocate for grants or other items. That's what they're here for.
Paul Jackson, for the record.
John Griggs, I'm sorry.
I think Paul was first.
Right. I think that in a situation, in certain situations, if a commissioner is asked a question who has good knowledge of a particular organization, I think that's more than reasonable. But if a commissioner has got an involvement with an organization and is pushing for their organization to get a grant, I think there is a conflict of interest there. It's a major conflict of interest. Not voting for it is one thing. Getting your friends to vote for it and possibly saying, I'll vote for this thing that you want if you vote for the thing I want, that kind of stuff is really against the public interest and is the kind of backroom politics and tactics that people hate and rise up against. So I think that if we have a fairly strict rule that if you're involved with an organization, that you shouldn't be lobbying for that. The grant should stand on its own, and the grant should be treated the same as every other grant, because what happens if 10 grants have nobody on the commission lobbying for them, but they're good grants, and then you have one grant that one of the commission members can have breakfast with somebody else or talk to somebody else to help them get that done. Again, that's unfair to the other grants. So I think in all fairness, and again, we want to, not only do we want to have complete transparency and complete everything completely above board, we don't even want the sense that something's not above board. So I think by putting this in, it actually helps us. Thank you.
Is there any other
Mr.
comment
Chairman,
on
John
that?
Riggs.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate what Mr. Jackson said, but I tend to agree with Mr. Lambert, and I think that if a commissioner lobbies for a grant in public during the public process, then everybody knows where he stands, as opposed to if he's not allowed to, or he or she's not allowed to, then they, you know, an unscrupulous type would then try to backdoor the deal. So to me, it makes more sense to keep it part of the public process and to let them speak for or against a particular grant that they're in favor of or not in favor of.
Chair, this is Gary Lambert.
Actually, Mr. Lee has a comment first.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that with John Griggs and Lambert. I think it's important. I understand Chairman Jackson's point. We need to be very careful. I think that's important that we're careful. But for an example, if we say organization, theoretically, anybody from the Sheriffs and Chiefs Association that puts in a grant, I would be unable to speak for any of those grants or about any of those grants. And since I'm the only law enforcement on the commission, I would think it would be important that if there's any questions about those grants for the law enforcement side, I should be able to answer those questions. If it was my grant for Lincoln County, then I, of course, would not vote. I would abstain from the vote, but I would at least like to comment and discuss and answer questions on grants from the organization that I belong to.
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you. I very much agree with Mr. Griggs and Sheriff Lee. I strongly support making it clear when you're involved with an event. The concerns that I have that really bother me the most are like phone calls looking for support for a side-by-side on Wednesday night. Those are the inappropriate phone calls that should be subject to sanction. Publicly making it knowledgeable that you have a position and that your community supports the position, or that there are a great many clubs that support that position, is totally appropriate. So I encourage us to move forward from this item. We have a clear understanding that it is inappropriate for some activities to be done in the back, as Mr. Jackson has said, and it is appropriate to do things in front of the board and the commission. So it seems to make sense that you're able to advocate in public, and it totally makes sense that you don't do that in private. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jackson, for the record.
Let's see if we... yes, sir.
One last thing. As to Sheriff Lee's point, I had actually said it would be it's totally appropriate for a person to answer questions if they have knowledge of a particular organization or club, and I think that would help with Sheriff Lee's, or Commissioner Lee's point that yes, somebody would be able to ask him questions of a law enforcement organization, even one within his own department. Secondly, it's sort of where do we draw the line where we say advocating in public, does that mean they can advocate when the public's around, or they can advocate via a phone call, or they can advocate on a break, all of these things. And again, I would just caution the Commission that this is it's a slippery slope, and it's something that could endanger decisions later on, because if, for example, somebody's a member of an organization and they get a grant, somebody else could come along who didn't get a grant and sue and say, hey, we weren't given an equal opportunity. These people were given an unfair advantage. So again, I would caution the Commission on this, but I agree with Mr. Lambert. Let's move on.
Commissioner Cox, Commissioner McKay, just one last point on this, number 11. Since our presence here is one precondition is some sort of participation in the OHV process in the state, I think as long as you publicly disclose what your interests are and don't vote on a project, there should be no prohibition for you to advocate for a project or oppose a project. So I agree with Commissioner Lee, Griggs, Lambert. We need to change that. Thank you.
Can we, could we just change it to the fact that since we don't want behind-the-scenes advocation going on, can we change it to say that during an open meeting that you're allowed, that's the only time you're allowed to advocate for it? Would that help clear this up?
I would agree to that. Paul Jackson for the record.
Strike public and leave private.
That'd be acceptable.
John Griggs.
Just strike the word private and just,
No, keep the word private, get rid of public, because you can do it in public, you shouldn't do it in private. See what I'm saying? Word private, get rid of the word public. So they can't advocate in private.
right. John, okay, Mr. Griggs?
I was just going to say, that sentence to me then should read, said commissioner or advisor will only speak in support for or lobby for in public.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
That's good.
All right. Is there anything else in the rest of this page other than the item line 15 where the commission was suggested that would change the word may to will?
John Griggs, I've got a couple of things, a couple of
Okay.
typos. Number 12, the commission will impose, not imposes.
Okay.
And then further in that sentence, it says advisor, it should be advisors. And presenters of any grant request, the sentence shouldn't end there.
Oh, yeah. It should just be one sentence.
And then after misrepresents their, THEIR.
Okay, moving on, the rest of the page.
13, sanctions will include but are,
Not limited.
and then at the end of that paragraph, the period being not less than 1 year, and you should have not more than 10 years.
Okay, anything else? 14, 15, 16?
16 to me is the same as 7, so we should defer it to whatever we do about 7.
All right, so for now, should we just strike 16 and we'll have to figure out 7?
I agree to that.
What about then what about 17? It was brought up, the commission may set rules and requirements to any and all grants as it feels necessary. It was pointed out earlier, and I think this came from, the fact that, wanting to do ride-alongs or wanting our signage on things. I think it's just, maybe we just need to spell that out clearly instead of leaving it so ambiguous. Any thoughts?
Charlie, Commissioner McKay for the record.
Yes.
I agree that being able to complete the project is a prime consideration, but I think maybe something may want to be inserted in there that the maximum benefit to the OHV community is also a paramount concern.
I would think that would happen earlier in once they got the grant. The benefit to the community is what we consider when awarding the grants, but during that process, we have to see if they can actually complete the process. So I'm not sure it should be combined here.
Okay. Just a concern.
Any other thoughts on that from anybody? All right, let's see if we can move on to the next page. Start with number 18.
Nope. Number 18.
Nope.
First page and see if you can.
Yeah.
Sorry, John Griggs.
Okay.
I would suggest that number 18, after supervision, you insert by the commission. And then where you say charge, it should be charged with a D.
Something that the commission has talked about, and we haven't made a decision on yet, is whether we're going to subcontract the supervision of the grants, the whole process of administering the grants out. And so I think that's where this sentence came from, because that's what we had, and it might even need to be, best I remember, we had gotten a bid or talked to somebody about they were going to charge 10% plus mileage if they had to go do anything. And so maybe that has to be spelled out a little more clearly, but I don't see us in the future as a commission being able to monitor all the grants we're probably going to get.
Charlie, John Griggs, I think the sentence you have here is perfect. I think grant by grant, we decide whether we want to manage it ourselves or sub it out. You know, it'll depend on the size and the scope of the grant. I just was cleaning the language up a little bit myself.
Are there any other thoughts on that? What about the last part of line number 19? How are we going to reconcile that with the grant guide?
Charlie, for the record, I think that's already clear. Regulations or laws, as far as we're concerned, and the guidebook. I mean, we have to make our regulations match what our guidebook's going to be.
Okay.
Even if we make adjustments to the guidebook, the regulations have to match it at the end.
I agree.
Comma after silence, so you understand what comma the commission.
I would encourage us on 23 to put some points on volunteerism and volunteer labor on our scoring criteria, Charlie.
Okay.
You might even
John
want to
Griggs, sorry, Mr. Lambert.
I apologize. It took me a while to develop a thought, and I'm not real quick today. Whether or not we choose to add points over 100, or we have some areas that are fairly strong. I mean, the club thing right now has 25 points if you look at the club recommendations and the communities. Maybe that's too heavy. Maybe that you need to give it 5 or 10 points there. But indeed, volunteerism is important. I tend to think that if we go back and mess with our old grade, we're just going to open a can of worms. So I think that we want to add 10 points for volunteerism to our guidebook for 23.
Chair, Paul Jackson for the record. It's my understanding that somewhere in our regulations we're going to have something to the effect of no one question can be more than, or no one factor or question can be more than 10%. So there would be some points coming back off that, and I agree with Mr. Lambert. We could use those points for volunteerism because I think that is very important. I mean, if not only from a financial point of view, in that it costs less to do something if you're using volunteers, but the other point of view is that when people actually have lifted up a shovel and done work on a project, they tend to be proud of it themselves. They take ownership, clubs, organizations, but even down to individuals. So I think that volunteerism is a major part, and I think it should be given, 10% of the points. And again, we can gain those obviously from the community support, because it is part of community support anyway. Thank you.
Right. I agree, and probably either in this section or another section, a couple pages later in this document, we talk about in-kind match, and I don't believe we have any points for that in our guidebook as well. So that needs to probably be incorporated. So we are going to have to mess with that guidebook scoring system. Well, we got to redevelop the whole guidebook to get it more accurate, as was pointed out earlier in the meeting. So I think that'll be a workshop of how exactly we do that.
Charlie, on number 24, if possible.
Uh-huh.
I think
Yes.
that I've read NRS 490 several times, and I think that what that 30% is talking about, as stated, no grant can be more than 30% of each category. I'm not sure that's the correct interpretation of that language. I believe that the 30% is trails or mapping cannot be over 30%, not that mapping has to be broken down into 10 items. I believe this is a misstatement on 24.
Charlie, John Griggs.
Yes.
I agree with you,
Go ahead.
Mr. Lambert. Try this language instead. No
Let's
grant will be
just look
awarded
at-
that exceeds, sorry.
Why don't we just get the Attorney General's opinion on that?
Try this and see what you think.
Go ahead.
No grant will be awarded that exceeds the maximum amount as defined by NRS 490.069.
I would second that. That's a wonderful idea.
Correct, but as commissioners, I don't have a clear idea what that is in my head, so I still think we need an Attorney General's ruling as to, so we're all on the same page.
Could I suggest we adopt his language, and then when the Attorney General weighs in on the document, he will point it out if there's an issue?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so moving on.
Charlie,
to the
John
rest
Griggs.
of this- Yes.
Before we get further, let me back up to number 20 and say that I think it should be lumped in with 7 and 16 and hammered out with those.
Okay.
And then, did you want me to read that again? Did you ask me that?
No, we'll just lump
Okay.
it together. All right, what else? 25, 26?
Number 25, the end of that sentence should be possible. As soon as possible.
And Commissioner McKay, for the record, I think making sure that we at least have, the public has 30 days notice of these grant postings before we take the matter up again is fairly essential. So it could be as soon as possible, but the public should have at least 30 days comment period on those grant proposals before we consider more action.
Paul Jackson.
Yes.
I personally like the word practical, but I've no objection to using the word possible. But to Mr. McKay's point, Commissioner McKay's point, I think we should leave ourselves as much latitude as reasonably possible, and to say to us we have to have 30 days viewing by the public is a nice idea, but there may be times when that's not practical. And I would be in favor of either reducing that period or just putting in that there is a period, because sometimes we may have 60 days and we may be able to allow them, but we may only have 15 at some points. And I think that people are interested, as long as it's put out to the interested parties, that, you know, those are available to review. I think that, you know, again, a few days would work for them. And again, that wouldn't tie us into doing something that makes it impossible to get something done quickly that we may need to do.
Well,
so I think we should leave ourselves flexibility.
Well, and this is a big can of worms too, because we haven't got there yet, but we have the dates, the deadline for the date, so we're going to have to, you know, consider those, and we're talking about this. And also we need to decide, are we going to put the entire grant application on the website or just a summary of it? You know, as we get more and more grants in the future, and we're restricted by how much administrative monies we can spend, this is going to be a huge job for someone to put on. I don't know how it's physically put on the web, if it's copied and pasted, scanned in. I don't know how time consuming this is, but if we have to put every grant in its entirety on the web, it could take 30 days just to do that.
Charlie? Gary Lambert for the record.
Yes, sir?
Posting
Yes.
these up when we require an electronic copy should not take 30 days. It's simply a matter of transferring a file protocol. I would oppose anything less than 15 days for public review for a couple reasons. Not only does the commission comprise itself of people that have other activities and jobs, but the public deserves at least a 2-week chance to get to it, given their schedule. So maybe we should just star this and make it a big item for public comment, but less than 14 days would seem inappropriate.
Paul Jackson for the record. I certainly could live with a 15-day period. We would like to, whenever we can, make it 30 days, and even longer if possible. But I think having a 15-day minimum, is within reasonable parameters. And as for the putting the grant applications on the website, we could always do, as long as we leave it open so that we could do a link, so that if somebody is looking for a particular grant, they can go through, just press on the link and get it over there. If we run out of space and it doesn't become practical to put it straight onto our website, we can at least provide the information to the public that are interested.
Charlie, Commissioner McKay for the record.
Yes.
I think those grants, and it can be through a link, should be posted in its entirety. I don't think you should leave anything else. You cause much more trouble leaving something out than having it in. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
John Griggs, we got disconnected there a bit. Are we still on 25?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what about 26? And how do we, NRS allows us to do this, so I want to make sure that it's correct in here.
John Griggs.
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's good. I suggest this language. The Commission may choose to award funds outside of grants as defined by NRS 490.
Gary Lambert for the record. John, would you
yes.
support having a cap on that? Should it be a 10% cap of the funds that we could issue outside of grants? Should it be a 15%? Should it scale back to 5 after a period of 5 years? We need more money to operate the system on, but as the money increases, is there any reason that we should just leave the cookie jar open out on the countertop? Should we show some physical restraint?
John Griggs, Gary, I think that's well said. I apologize. I didn't have time to look it up, but I think that's kind of defined, isn't it? Isn't there a
no?
Isn't it pretty?
The funds that they're talking about, the funds that they're talking about in this language, unless I'm mistaken, are funds that we've typically referred to as grantable funds, and that's fine because the Commission isn't able to productively conduct its business and fund its enterprise on the 5% it's allowed. But if I were to talk about the language that's involved with spending that additional money, I would cap it at 10% and have it fall backwards at a period of 4 years down to 5%, 1% a year, because the Commission shouldn't leave the cookie jar up for its own dining delight. It just shouldn't. We need money to get our job done, but we need limitations too. And if that doesn't work after 5 years, we could go back and revisit the regulations. But I would be very opposed to language that would allow the grant funds to be issued without a grant cycle and a scoring sheet on a normal basis. To do it for 5 years while we get some infrastructure in place and have some professional help with grants and criterias in scoring, I think I could sell that to my user groups. Do I think the user groups would be uncomfortable having discussed this? I think they should be. There needs to be a cap. I know that Leo Drum has mentioned several times that we need more money to operate proficiently and professionally. He's adamant that we can't do our job with 5%. I agree. I agree that we have not taken good care of our staff, but I want a cap on that. I would like to see a cap on that of no more than 10% in the first 5 years, dropping 1% thereafter to 5% maximum in 10 years, and we should learn to live without that money.
Paul Jackson for the record.
Gary.
Yes, sir.
Let's
Yes,
go with
John.
Paul first.
I would just interject that in Mr. Griggs's version of the 26, that we do include that this sum of money can be spent directly by the commission to support what other language he puts in there, but basically make sure that it's said spent directly by the commission. As to a cap, I really have no big opinion on that, but again, as long as it says spent by the commission and not awarded to somebody else outside the grant process.
Mr. Griggs?
John Griggs. Thank you, John Griggs. Gary, I agree with you in premise that there should be a cap. The only holdup I have to that, maybe we should hammer this out in workshop, is that I think we're pretty limited what we can spend there, and I'm trying to find where it says that we can, and I can't right now. But I think we're pretty limited anyways. But if we hammer this out in the workshop, I totally agree with you that there should be a cap, but we shouldn't be capping. You know, if the language says we can spend 5%, we shouldn't be capping 10% of 5%. Do you know what I mean? We shouldn't limit ourselves to a couple $100 here if that's what it works out to.
John, I think you have the right technique. We just need to do our research and bring this up for public input. We need to sell the fact that we might need to get in their cookie jar to them during the workshops anyway. And the truth is, we need a little bit more money to get our work done. Thank you, John.
I agree. Thank you.
Well, I agree. Let's hammer this out in the workshop. 10% I think would be a good starting point. It just brings to mind we wanted to fund some advertising, get people on board with the whole registration program. We ought to be able to do that. Okay, let's move on to general compliance and NEPA requirements. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Do we need to add to that then? It needs to be done before they apply for a grant, like we discussed earlier in the meeting?
John Griggs.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Maybe Leo can address this a little bit, but to me, there's a whole lot besides NEPA that we need to be thinking about on public lands anyways, and we should probably say being completed on federal land must be in compliance with applicable federal statutes instead of NEPA.
John, I think you're on a good track. This is Gary Lambert for the record. And I'm looking for the guidebook right now. If I remember right, the guidebook had significant language in there. And as long as we go back and readdress that with the public, we ought to be in good shape, sir.
Chair, we have Mr. Drummond has come up to the the presentation desk.
For the record, okay, Leo Drummond, Bureau of Land Management. Yeah, there's more than just NEPA. There's also Section 106 compliance, cultural resources, clearance through SHPO. There's a variety of things. So if you leave it as general as possible, just saying that it needs to meet whatever regulations. Yeah, those kind of things. And then the other thing, just to make sure that this would be for on-the-ground projects, say ground disturbance, because obviously grants could be awarded for the NEPA. So as long as that distinction is made, I think that would work.
I have a question for Mr. Drummond. Mr. Drum, is it
Okay.
not true that general maintenance items are generally exempt of NEPA if they're not highly ground disturbing?
There's really nothing exempted from NEPA.
Okay.
There's always NEPA documentation that has to occur. For certain general projects that occur, a lot of times there might be a programmatic environmental assessment that's already taking place. We'll call that it's already been done, so we'll look at that document to see if this project falls underneath that. Or there are some broad categories called categorical exclusions. So like putting a signpost generally is going to fall under that category. It could, depending on the location, if there are significant cultural resources in the area, we might not even be able to use that categorical exclusion and do some other NEPA documentation, but there's always something.
Thanks. I just remembered some exclusions on the helipad. I think we work well together. Thank you, Leo.
Thank you. And plus, in our grant application, we have the sign-up sheet from whichever federal agency you're working with. So I think just keeping this broad is really all we need to do, because when it gets to the specific project, there will already be coordination with the agency and the sign-off sheet.
That's well said, Charlie. That's what we have to hang our hat on. We don't, to my mind, ever want to be in the business of telling a grant awardee that, yes, they've crossed all their T's when it's up to a federal agency to determine that.
Right.
With that being said, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say, with that being said, under permitting requirements, I would almost suggest we delete all the items that you have listed. They're good items, but I know it's an incomplete list, and we don't want to lead anybody on that they've done all they had to do by looking at this list.
Any other thoughts on that?
I agree with deleting
I'm-
it because it's not complete. Gary Lambert, for the record. I think that we can readdress this in the workshop roughly to see what people's input is and to have a private conversation with the BLM and the Forest Service in that regard also. It's really something that belongs back in the actual scoring guide and the grant guidelines. And when we get that straightened up, we need to double check to make sure our regulations match it well. So I do encourage us just to delete that for today.
That list, but what about the first paragraph about where it talks about no funds will be released until all applicable permits and clearances are in place? We okay with leaving that part in there? And just delete the list?
Yeah, I think so.
Anybody else?
The only thing I'd say to that, John Griggs, is that some of this stuff takes years. A cultural clearance may take years.
Right, but we're just
we've
saying
heard
that
the NEPA.
Right, but all this is saying is that if we award somebody a grant, we're not going to release funds to them until all those permits are in place. We can't give them the money and then let them take years to spend it.
Right.
Paul Jackson, for the record. One of the things with the 90 days is, and Mr. Drummond can correct me if I'm wrong, but if somebody's applied for all the permits and done all the work and basically been told that the permits are on the way, they're going to be signed, the stuff will be prepared, then that 90 days is probably a good idea because, for example, the NEPA study's been done, but it hasn't been signed off on. I mean, am I correct, Mr. Drummond? Could somebody accurately be able to say everything will be ready, within that 90 days? Go ahead, sir.
For the record, Leo Drum, Bureau Land Management. That would be up to you. There are certainly times when I could foresee just what you said. A NEPA document is just waiting to be signed, and the grants are due on this day. And the applicant would not have that signed NEPA document in hand. It would be reasonable to assume that it would be available in a certain amount of time. You might want to give yourself some wiggle room as far as that goes, but you could certainly say that, before you award money, that all of that needs to be in hand and be completed.
Would we, Paul Jackson for the record, would we be able, just for sake of argument, if somebody came to us and said, yeah, I've got all the documentation, but BLM has still got to have some things signed, it's 30 days out, would it be then appropriate for them to, would they be able to bring you, would you be able to make that statement, or your counterpart be able to make that statement, yes, this organization has complied with everything, and we expect their documentation in 30 or 60 days?
I'm sure we could provide that, to the commission.
And then that would save a good grant having to wait an extra year to apply for the grant because, the documentation isn't quite ready yet.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, I appreciate it. Thanks, sir.
There are times that things, are just going to slow down due to other workload priorities or something like that, so, yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Okay.
Charlie?
Are we able to move on to the next? Yes?
Yeah, I was just going to say, you're Commissioner McKay, for the record, the line of no funds will be released until all the permits and clearances are in place is great. That's a good catch-all.
And if it's awarded, it's not going to be released.
Okay. Let's move on to the next page, categories of grants, small, medium, and large. Any comments on those?
Charlie, Gary Lambert for the record. I find this to be exclusionary and unrequired and not having a precedent in the adjoining states. I would strike it, put points in for match. May I finish? And put points in for match in the guidebook. And the points in match for the guidebook could encourage the same activity but not eliminate anyone. Thank you for your time, Charlie.
Paul Jackson for the record. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul.
All right. I like the system of breaking them down, and the reason for that is we might choose to have, and as been previously discussed, we may choose to have slightly different rules for different grants. For example, we may have a club that comes along and they're looking for a grant for $10,000 to do a project. They have no experience with doing grants. This is going to be the first time that they've done a project like this. Well, I think that we should have more relaxed rules for somebody like that than we do for Orbis or the University of Nevada. We need to, I think by categorizing this allows us to change the rules. For example, on the larger grants, I would probably suggest that they have to be a 501c3 or a 501c4, which most of the people who are applying for the larger grants are anyway. But that's a tough rule to put on a club with 25 members. And there are other parameters as well. And I think as we go through this, they'll start to come out in the wash. But again, I don't want to impose. I think we should have good rulemaking, and I don't want to impose a rule that would be good for a larger organization on a smaller organization. And again, one of the things that came up was pre-funding. If it's a smaller organization and they're asking for $5,000 or $10,000, then maybe pre-funding's a good idea for that specific thing. But we don't want to pre-fund or even put into the suggestion a grant for $200,000. So again, breaking this out into small, medium, and large. I don't know whether the numbers are correct, and I think that's something we need to flesh out. But I think having that structure allows us to make different rules for different size of grants, and I think that will work to the benefit, especially smaller organizations, that will work to the benefit of the, in general, of the OHV community. Thank you.
I can say that this came out of Colorado. They do use this. That's where I got it from. And there again, over the years, when I've been involved with clubs, and I tell the clubs I'm involved with now, if you want to do a major project, you need to start saving up some funds so you have a cash match. You know, if our, and it's probably going to be a collaborative effort with the federal agency. You know, I know in my area, I would love to put handicap accessible toilets at a trailhead that, you know, several 100,000 people use a year. This weekend happens to be all the BLM that are rounding up cattle. But in that case, you know, our grant program cannot simply be an open bank that is just giving away money to everybody. They have to have some sort of financial responsibility in it. So like I said, this came from Colorado. They're using it. We want to tweak the numbers a little bit, but I would be opposed to striking it altogether.
John Griggs, Charlie.
Yes.
I would just suggest that for medium and large, we add the language, will require at least a 25% cash match. And, you know, if a group wants to kick in more, then they'll score higher in the scoring process, but we don't want to imply that that's the set amount.
Okay, that's a good idea. And, you know, maybe here too, maybe we should put some in-kind match in with these, you know, to help ease the burden. Just subject for discussion.
Mr. Cox, Paul Jackson for the record. I think putting a sort of written in stone match on some of these things may be problematic. And again, I think it comes down to, you know, if it's a large grant, yes, maybe we should have a 25% match or whatever the number comes. A medium grant could be something different. On the smaller grants, I really don't want to kick out smaller organizations that may not have the ability to get a match, or the type of organization that's a for-profit that's doing a survey, for example. I don't want them to, you know, to be in a situation where they have no match. So again, I would ask that we don't write something in stone on matches. The smaller grants, maybe we look at a smaller number, maybe it's 10 grand or something like that, but I think we should be encouraging smaller groups who maybe haven't been around a long time to be able to get those smaller grants, build up a history or a collaboration with us, and maybe in 5 years the group's grown and they go for a much bigger project. But I think we should be encouraging the small projects, the smaller grants, and I don't think writing something in stone as to how much should be matched is a good idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, so for the small grants here, it says under 25,000 would not require a match. Is that acceptable?
I think once we flesh out the numbers, yes. But again, even on the medium grants, suppose we go to an organization like the university and say, hey, we want to do a study on sagegrass. There is no real study done. There's nobody can definitively say if you're within 300 yards of a nest that you're not disturbing or you are disturbing the nest. And those are the kind of studies that we need to do, because quite honestly, those are the kind of studies that can't be funded by a lot of other organizations. They can be done by us, and they would allow pretty much the benefit of everybody, because everybody could take that study, and if they need to take that to BLM and say, hey, this road is half a mile away from the nesting area, you can't close it off. Because BLM is looking at, right or wrongly, a blanket closing of areas, and I've been given numbers of 1.3 million acres, but I don't know if those are completely accurate or not, but they're doing a blanket closure, and we need to stop that, and one of the ways we can stop that is by doing studies and being able to go to court if necessary to prove our point that if a road is within less than a quarter of a mile, a half mile, I don't know what the number is, of a nesting area, well, that road should remain open. So again, there would be no match on those types of grants. those grants will be done by universities, and we'd be the only ones funding it because other organizations can't. So again, even on medium, I think writing in stone that they have to have a grant match really restricts us and could really end up biting us in the end.
Commissioner Cox, Commissioner McKay,
Yes.
I liked your idea of perhaps inserting some language for in-kind services to be applicable to the match, such as volunteer labor, donated materials, donated equipment, etc. And perhaps we can put some language in this section that we're looking for economies of scale and incentives for these people to get a better project. So, and that might go back to the grant guide also. Thank you.
Thank you.
For the
All
record,
right, so
Gary,
for now, go ahead.
for the record, Gary Lambert, I most wholeheartedly agree that in-kind matches are important. I still find this problematic, and I would encourage us to make this an asterisk point for workshops, both on grants and regulations. Let the public get their weight in on it.
Okay. Then let's move on to the dates. This I just made these dates. It's a little longer than we had in the past, with the deadline being December 1st and the holidays and all that involved. I know this last year we really struggled with getting everything done. So I guess what your guys' thoughts are as far as start the process in October. That gives clubs, organizations 2 months to get them to us. Then for our staff to do a review, that date from December 1st to January 1st might be a little tight there, especially with getting them on the website. I don't know. I'm open to thoughts.
Charlie?
Mr. Lambert?
Yeah, I think that I'm not comfortable that we want to set these dates and regulations and have no ability to move them. This seems like something we've discussed several times, probably prior to your being involved, Charlie. We need some ability to not only address things that might come up quickly, but we also need the ability, if we don't get ready in time, not to wait another year. Regulations likely do not require dates in them, as this is a permanent set of handcuffs in my mind, and something we should not encourage ourselves to be cornered with.
Paul Jackson for
John
the record.
Griggs.
Let's do Paul first and then John.
The dates, again, the dates are restrictive. It does put us in a tight situation. For example, I could foresee us wanting to try and get our grant process maybe done this year by July, simply because it would be nice to get some grants out there this year and would certainly help us politically. But I think we should replace this with language that the Commission will set dates and then give us some parameters. For example, the 15 days minimum for the grant applications to be on the internet or available, and basically just replace it with language that says we shall set dates and we shall make provision for those dates to be no less than 15 days, for it to be on the internet, no less than 30 days for applicants to be made, that type of thing, and just give ourselves some kind of parameters like that that would allow us to do this. But again, setting a specific date may end up being problematic. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We could keep to a general rule that we do it once a year, and we usually try to do it by, in the month of January. I mean, that could be sort of a general understanding, but again, having specific dates could end up being very problematic.
Chairman Cox, I agree with Mr. Jackson on this issue, that it needs to be left to where we can set our dates and move our dates without making it a regulation. I think that the public can weigh in on this and we can get it right through some public input. I would encourage us to move on.
Mr. Griggs had a comment, and then Mr. Lee, I believe, has a comment.
I'm in line with everybody. I was just going to suggest that instead of dates, we announce the availability of funds and what those funds are, and then we say the deadline for application is X amount of days after that. And we go through your list, but instead of a date, we put the amount of days that needs to happen.
Okay, Mr. Lee.
As Commissioner Lee, for the record, I just think that the dates ought to be in the guidebook, something that we can change. So I would put that, we should refer to the guidebook for the grant cycle or something like that.
All right, let's move on. Application rules. Do we really need one original and 2 copies? I know we need the electronic copy. Do we need those extra 2 copies?
Paul Jackson for the record. Having the original and 2 copies saves us on copying costs. Some of these applications are large, and we have to probably keep one copy with our executive secretary in our records. Another copy may need to go to somebody else. So again, having those copies is great because it really cuts down on our cost, because we may have to duplicate them, for other uses, for record uses.
Okay.
So again, when we went through this originally, I think we discussed it at length, and we came up with, we need 3 copies plus electronic.
All right. What about line 2? Anyone have a comment on that?
Maybe a suggestion, Charlie, Commissioner McKay. Near the end of the sentence, do the high number of applications, any application that is found maybe to be substantially complete or not substantially complete. Everybody's going to have a glitch here and there. Leave yourself open.
But then it leaves it arbitrary to what's substantial or not. I mean, it does
True.
say that.
True.
Line 3 says an attempt will be made by us to, get the information we need.
Okay.
So.
Okay. We can leave it as is then.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not opposed to what you're saying. I'm just saying the more open we leave it, that's when I think we get ourselves into trouble. So. Yeah. Anybody else?
Mr. Chair, John Griggs.
Yes.
I'm with Commissioner McKay. To me, if the way things have gone or apparently have gone, to me, if there's a good application and one letter is not correct or something really, really minor is not correct, somebody could have it thrown or set aside. There should be a little bit of flexibility to say that, the grant or the application is essentially there. We can score it.
Okay. So then just add that word substantial like was suggested.
I agree to that, yes.
Substantially incomplete.
Sounds all right.
Let's move on. All right, anything else? What about in line 4, where in parentheses I put, in a summary of, demand for projects, the cost, the budgets that are not clearly defined and specific. Do we want to leave that wording in there? I think we had some problem. You always have problems with that. Just thinking exactly how is this money going to be used and for what? Instead we had a lot of people approach us with broad, just grandiose ideas, but weren't very specific in how the money was going to be spent. So, thoughts on that?
I would, Paul Jackson for the record, I would agree with that. I think that we need to in fact, maybe even be more specific, so that we can, so draw out exactly what's going on there, and people aren't. And again, if there's language in there that says how specific they have to be, then they're not being hit with some surprise when they get there and say, "Oh, I didn't know I had to do this or that." So again, I think that's correct. I think it's a good idea.
Anyone else?
So Charlie, just so I'm sure, Commissioner McKay, that you wanted to just put this for information on the end of that section 4, or you want to take it off?
You mean the very last part about maps, photos, design, or about
Yeah.
the clearly defined and specific?
Yeah,
Well,
you
I think everything. I think we're trying to get the applications as specific as we can get.
right.
You know, and there again, we may have to do some more research with the BLM. You know, we had a lot of people, several different groups from several different means, wanting to survey trails and make sure that they were on the in the BLM record. But I don't know, and I don't think you can just walk into the BLM anytime and say, "Hey, I want to make sure this trail." I think it has to be something that they're working on, or I just don't know how we do that. I know as a commission and as users, we want to make sure that all our trails are in the BLM record. But I don't know if we just fund somebody to go out and do that one way or another, if it actually gets into the BLM record, So there's got to be some tie-in there with, you've already collaborated with the BLM and you're going to work on this specific area and make sure the trails in this specific area are in their record.
Yeah, maybe we could just expand that list to the grant application has, say, an MOU with BLM or Forest Service, appropriate support letters, permits, and it probably would tie back to the grant guide also.
Okay, good idea.
Charlie, Gary Lambert for the record.
Yes.
Well, I don't mean to
Go ahead.
disappoint you, Charlie. Geez, the guidebook has clearly stated that the letters of support are important, and the letters of support in the past have spoken to the specifics of the project. If we're reading the entire grant package and the letters of support, and we read them clearly, and it's not clear, then perhaps we need to ask questions in that period of time before the grants go to the full committee when we're supposed to review them, as I did a couple of people. But indeed, those letters of support provide the knowledge that they're interested in trail data, as you said. Indeed, I've never had a BLM office not accept trail data, but that's not a high enough standard for a grant, because we've already asked for a support letter from the BLM if it's to be mapped on the BLM. So clearly understanding our own guidebook and our own grant application resolves a lot of the confusion that I've heard within the commission. So we just need to spend more time understanding our own documents and our applicants' guides and grant applications. I think that it's self-explanatory myself.
Paul Jackson for the record. I think we need to get as much specifics into the actual grant itself. I don't think we should be relying on letters of support to explain what the grant does or why. And some of the areas, not all the commissioners are familiar with. I mean, it's one commissioner may have a really good knowledge about one particular area, trail mapping, for example, and another commissioner may have a lot of knowledge about something else, but not on those subjects. So I think, in fairness to the people who are applying for the grants, the more detail, the better, and the more that we can get that across to them, the better it is. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm not sure letters of support is the correct term there. I think we asked for a letter from the BLM or the Forest Service, whatever agency you're working in. That letter, I think, is where it should be clearly defined. I think all this is saying is that in your application, even though you've talked to the BLM, you have a MOU with them, please provide for us maps, photos, whatever specifications that we might need to make a better, to make a decision. So that's all. I think that's all I was trying to say with that.
I think that if we're going to do that, we need to change our grant guidebook to allow inclusion of pieces of paper larger than 11 by 17 and files larger than that, for it simply doesn't fit given our guidebook. We've painted ourselves in a corner regarding the grant guide.
Paul Jackson, for the record, I think that's a good idea. We do need to change the guidebook in this respect because obviously, we've experienced, we've got more idea of what we want, and I don't see any problem with increasing the size of a piece of paper or some of the dynamics of that to make it easier for us to understand. I think that the main goal is for all of the commissioners to understand each and every issue and each and every part of this, and those commissioners that don't understand it need to be educated to it so they can give a fair judgment for a grant application.
Okay. Well, good. We'll talk to the grant committee and get them working on their guidebook. All right, let's move on. Does anybody else have anything on this page?
John Griggs.
Lee. Commissioner Lee put.
I think number 5 should be added to number 1 and get rid of number 5 because it's the same thing. It's just defining what the electronic copy is. You've already asked for it up here. I think it just needs to be moved up to number 1 and just get rid of number 5.
All right. Mr. Griggs?
Number 3, instead of the 12:01 a.m. December 1 deadline, maybe have it read the noticed grant cycle deadline.
That's right.
Right, what we just talked about.
Right.
Okay, the match items, the in-kind match items, that came right out of the guidebook. I don't know if we want to discuss any changes to that or leave them as they are. Guess we'll leave them as they are. All right, so the next page, bidding process. The top of the second to the last page, bidding process. I think with this, when it seemed like we were telling all the applicants that came before us that were wanting funding for tangible items that, they had to go out and get 3 bids and buy it within the state whenever possible and all of those things. So I just kind of put that down in the regulations so that we wouldn't have to tell everybody specifically that. So I guess what I'm wondering here is if I stated it the way you guys interpreted it. Mr. Lee.
I'm totally good with the bidding process, but if you want to, that bidding process is already spelled out in Nevada Revised Statute. So I don't know if we're going to make it more restrictive than what the state of Nevada is already doing in the bidding process. If we are, that's fine. It doesn't matter. It's just the point of it is the bidding process is already spelled out by the state. And I think that spelled out is, don't quote me on the figures, but I think anything under $25,000 does not have to be bid. 25 to 50 has to have 2 bids, and 50 and above have to be advertised and bid. That's what the state says.
Any more thoughts? I don't have a problem with making it the same as what the state says. I just thought we should have something in regulations about it.
Paul Jackson, for the record, I like what we've got. Again, a lot of, if somebody goes out and buys an ATV or a side-by-side or something, that's going to be well under $25,000. And I still think we should go out and they should have to get, reasonable bids. I believe we put whatever practical or whatever possible in the bid process, because there are some small towns or small areas where they only have 2 dealers. But given that exception only, I think what we've got written up is good, and I think we should be a little stricter than the NRS. Thank you.
Mr. Lee?
This is Commissioner Lee and Commissioner Jackson. I'm totally good with that. I don't really care. I'm just giving you guys information on what the state guidelines are, and I'm good with it. I don't think anybody that we've talked to had a problem with getting the bids. I think that's good.
Yeah, it just keeps it open and fair for the public, so any other thoughts?
Charlie, and I can look
Charlie,
in.
change.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I think Mr. McKay was first and then Mr. Gray.
I was just going to say change particle to practical.
Oh. Mr. McKay, do you have a thought?
Yeah, according to state statute, I'm not exactly sure of the language, but for professional services, sometimes they have the most responsible and responsive bidder. It gives you a little bit more of a leeway, but we'll just have to check with what the state has to say with that.
Okay. All right, eligible cost. Any thoughts? This again, the eligible and non-eligible cost came straight out of Colorado. We can tweak it however we see fit. Obviously, in non-eligible, we've already talked about deleting flyers, brochures, and publications. So as you guys read down through that list, is it complete enough? Anything we should add, delete?
I'm marking a couple things up. I'll give you back.
Okay.
John Griggs.
Yes, sir.
I feel like for non-eligible costs, we should say asset purchases over a set amount, like for argument, $2,500. We can say that rent during the grant period can be applied towards purchase, but we're not going to buy somebody say a pickup that's going to last 20 years that they're going to use for our benefit for 2 years. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I don't know how to put it into words.
Well, I'll help you with that I'll help you with that after discussion.
Okay. Mr. Lee?
I had something different than what he had.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if we want to move.
Well, let's see. So is there any further discussion on that? I think I'm trying to read here real quick to see, like I put vehicle maintenance. I was thinking this pertained especially to agencies and when they use their vehicles. Their vehicles get maintained, their vehicles get gassed. They have their vehicles, and therefore so do volunteers. And so I don't even foresee us, anyone coming to us for purchase of a pickup truck. But stranger things have happened, I would suppose. But that's what I was trying to eliminate, at least in the non-eligible, is that agencies should not be able to bill for that, but a volunteer should be able to get reimbursed for mileage.
Charlie, this is Gary Lambert for the record. I agree with you that mileage is important for nonprofits. I also disagree with flyers and brochures and publication printing being non-eligible. Volunteer insurance should be eligible also. And vehicle maintenance does not need to be eligible because we've allowed nonprofits to file for mileage. I could see us having trouble without paying mileage for contractors to do mapping that would not be nonprofits. If we were to hire Great Basin or Resource Concept Services to map the pine nuts, they're not going to touch us without being able to drive to the job site. So I think that not allowing mileage for government agencies you may get away with, but you got to allow it for contractors, plain and simple. How are you going to, you going to bury the fact that they have mobilization when they put a toilet in, or are you going to allow them to run an honest set of books?
Well, I didn't.
I'm
doesn't say
not,
anything
it's
about
all just for
contractors.
discussion. I'm not saying we did anything
I
wrong.
know,
I
but
just
so-
think that mileage, if it's not for government entities, I'm not even opposed to them getting mileage in circumstances we know they've asked for it. We have the ability to delete line items from their grant request anyway. I don't think we should hand tie ourselves in not allowing mileage, time associated with grant writing, flyers, and volunteer insurance belong as eligible items, to my mind. Maybe we should just let the public weigh in on that.
Paul Jackson for the record.
Marketing and advertising needs to be too.
Go ahead.
I think that looking at some of the public comment, the two pieces of public comment we've got, and some comment I got from other individuals orally, I think that this is certainly one of the issues that needs to be done on the workshop basis. I think we can come in and take some things out and add some things in right now, but I think this is a good list to start with, and I think that this is something that we really need to do at the workshop. This is the sort of thing that, you know, we need to go through one at a time, get some opinion from the public, get some opinion from contractors, get some opinion from, you know, possible grantees, and get an idea of what they do. Again, I mean, I see a couple of things like the flyers and brochures and things, and somebody in public comment had said earlier, that's what education grants are for. So again, I really think that this should be gone through with a number of people who are actually going to be using grants and get their opinion, and I think this should be, you know, I would request that we move on and put this out as a specific item in the workshop. Thank you.
I would agree with that. Okay, then the last page, application fee. I think we'd already discussed this prior, that we would not charge a fee for just someone applying. Hopefully no one's changed their mind on that, but now would be the time to comment. And then grant awards and disbursement of funds. Any thoughts on that section? You know, the first paragraph we've already discussed, reimbursement basis. We might have to make some provisions for that. I don't know if you do it in regulations. You know, we had already tried to make the provisions that we would write the check directly to the supplier or the manufacturer if it was for the purchase of equipment. I don't know how. I don't know what else to do here. You know, we don't, again, don't want to be like a bank and just give our money out and then hope they spend it where they said.
I'm Paul Jackson for the record. One sort of issue relating to this is what do we do about a project that genuinely has an issue where it can't be completed in 2 years? For example, there was a flood in the area and some of the work was washed away and they had to restart, or a piece of equipment wasn't available for rental. So some good reason why we have to. Do we need to deal in this section with being able to extend time periods for projects, or even, heaven forbid, somebody is under budgeted and to complete a project they need an extra 10% or an extra 15%? Do we want to deal with that in this section? Do we want to put some language together for that? I'm done.
Those are all good points. This too, when I put this in here, it was because there are times when applicants just get lazy and don't complete the project in 2 years. And so how do you separate that from somebody who, as you just pointed out, may have had something washed away or whatever? So yeah, maybe we're going to have to get some direction on that, but somehow, I mean, it'd be nice if we could even put a 1-year date on there, you know, or somehow break it down to these different sizes of projects have a definite end date. And I think I discussed that a little bit in the agreement for the grant over here, which we'll get to in a moment, that you know, there needs to be somehow a definite end date, a reasonable end date to a project when we fund it. You know, if somebody has a problem or they are under budget, yes, we need to deal with that as well. But
Can you just add unless waived by the commission?
Mr. Lee suggests, can we just add, you know, unless approved by the commission with a 2/3 majority or something like that?
Paul Jackson for the record. I think that's a good idea, but I think we need to put some kind of provision in there that allows us to do that. And I also agree that we probably should have, this rule should be different for smaller projects than bigger projects. For example, if the university or somebody comes in and they give us an estimate on what a job will cost, I would expect an experienced, you know, entity like that would know exactly what's going to cost and figure in any delays or problems. Somebody's coming in for 10 grand to fix a trailhead. They may not, and they may not be experienced. And again, I want to encourage smaller entities who have got less experience to come in. So again, maybe we should look at this as 3 sets of rules. You know, the rules for the big guys, the rules for the medium guys, and the you know, the rules for the first timers, as to how we do that. I mean, we may switch. The project has to be done within a year for the smaller projects, things like that, because that may be just a bunch of you know, trail mapping, and what we're doing is providing GPSs and some other sort of logistics support. So again, I think that. I think we need to flesh this out. I think it needs to be something that we really look at, and I would encourage the Commission to basically come up with 3 sets of rules, as I said, one for the large guys, one for the medium, and one for the small guys. Thank you.
Okay, any other thoughts?
John Griggs, just a couple of edits. In the second paragraph, it says, in some cases, you don't need an apostrophe there. And then further, it says, cost of equipment. Equipment needs an M there in the middle.
Yeah, someone proofread. Okay.
And then after that, and other such costs, should be costs.
Okay.
And then I would, if we're kind of done with this, or if we're past this, I wonder if we don't need some language about a grantee being in default, somebody that's taken our money but hasn't completed the project.
Yes. Did I address that in the grant agreement? Let's look at that and then maybe come back, because there's also another.
Oh, okay.
But
that's good.
Yeah, I don't think so. So, all right. So the grant agreement, I tried to make, you know, I was thinking we needed to have some kind of formal contract. Once we award the grant, I was thinking, okay, we need to have a legal way to, like you just said, if they default, if they don't do what they said they were going to do, how do we handle it? You know, so that was kind of my idea for this grant agreement, to be, in the end, after you get awarded your grant, you're going to sign an agreement with this commission to the scope of work, the performance period, which will have the end date, how the schedule of payments are going to be made, termination, your financial responsibilities, and successors and assignments. And I got that out of Colorado, I believe, as well. So let's just go through this a little bit and see if we how much tweaking it needs. So under scope of work.
Wait, back up, Charlie. Just say that where you say this agreement is made, you don't need that is. This agreement made.
Okay.
And then we've been taken to task for this before, where you say made available from the trails. Trails should be projects. That category is more encompassing than just trails. It should say projects.
Well, I used the word there that was defined in NRS because that's how NRS broke everything down: trails, law enforcement, public education. So I don't know if we can change that.
No, that's not quite right. There's several different categories there. There's mapping and signage, there's acquisition of land, there's enhancement and maintenance of trails, construction of trails, restoration of areas. So projects is more inclusive than trails.
Okay. All right, anything else? Scope of work, performance period, any of those areas?
The only other thing I have on this page, Charlie, is under number 3, you say grant application as approved, put a D on that, approved by the commission.
Mm-hmm. Is a 30-day time frame after we get the invoice acceptable?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. That's Commissioner McKay for the record, Charlie.
All right, I understand, yes. You know, number 4 on recreational use, you know, there have been times when in the past when I can think of, you know, all good intentions, the project got funded, and then all of a sudden the land was no longer available for motorized recreation. So I was just trying to cover that.
Charlie, John Griggs, you bring up a good point, but I think it needs to be more general in that whatever the project is, it shouldn't be converted away from the project. It's conceivable that somebody applies for and gets awarded in a grant to restore a place that was inappropriately used by OHVs, and that's not a recreational use, but it is covered in the NRS.
Right, that's covered in the NRS.
So we just need to make that more general in that, you know, it can't be converted from its granted use.
Well, I guess in this case, what came to mind was the grant application we had in Caliente for the motocross track, that during the course of the discussion came up that the city may not allow it to be there, and they would try then to move it someplace. So I was just trying to cover that, you know.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with your premise. I'm just saying we need to be more general to cover any possible thing we award a grant for.
All right. Okay, so how about, now here's one for you, a termination. So I listed some specific things there. Do we need to be more specific, or sponsor failed to comply with the terms of the agreement, sponsor had insufficient funds to complete the project, sponsor fails to begin work on the project within 1 year? I mean, what? Was that tying what you brought up a minute or two ago, John?
I think it's good, Charlie, but I'm not sure that it covers if an organization is awarded in a grant and they just don't they spend some money and we reimburse them, but then they don't complete the project. I think we need to define what happens to them if they're in default of what they agreed to. No, to me, that's outside of terminating the project.
Okay. All right, we can add some language there. And then what about in the next section under the financial responsibilities? I'm assuming at the end of the project, we're going to want a very accurate and complete set of records and receipts of all the expenditures, written records. So I wonder if this section is complete enough. I assume some of it will be getting, as they turn in an invoice for work completed, we'll be getting some of it during that time, but I'm assuming that somehow we're going to have a very accurate record of all these grants that we keep on file someplace. Any thoughts in Carson? Did we lose you up there? I can't see you.
No, I think we're, Commissioner McKay, for the record, I think we're in general agreement with where you're going.
Yeah.
Charlie, John Griggs, just a general thought. I know our regulations will go through, isn't it LCB? We'll go through somebody, yes, for approval, but as far as a contract should be looked at by a lawyer, and I don't know if that's the same thing. And I don't know if the AG does that or just a general thought question.
Paul Jackson for the record. If we ask our AG to look at the contract, he probably will, but he may turn around and say it's outside of his purview. Because they're very specific. We're allowed to ask them questions and they're allowed to give us advice. But as to something like a contract, and I don't know this for a fact, but he may or may not be able to do that. It may be something that we have to go out and get an outside attorney to do. There are attorneys within our scope who would probably do it for free. But I do agree with Mr. Riggs that we certainly should have an attorney look at it. But we can ask the AG to take a look at it, but if he doesn't, then we may have to go to somebody else.
Mr. Lee? Mr. Lee?
I think that we might be able to go to one of the other granting agencies in the state, like state parks or the Department of Public Safety, Michelle Hamilton. They already have contracts that may cover. We maybe could use one of theirs instead of having to pay somebody to redo this one. Just as a thought.
Well, it's a good thought. I think we should start there and bring it to the workshop. And I'm just running through the agenda real quick to see if there's any items that I have forgotten or overlooked. Mr. Lee passed me a note. None of these regulations address an appeals process. Is that something y'all think we should address in the future?
Yeah, we should address appeals and conflict resolution both.
Yes. Okay.
Paul Jackson for the record. We may want to put appeals into our guidebook as opposed to trying to put them into regulation, simply because we may need to change the appeals process. But if we have an appeals process, that protects us to some degree against lawsuits, because if somebody goes straight to a judge, the first question the judge is going to say, do you have regulations, and was there an appeals process? And if they've not followed the appeals process, then they would probably find that that claim was not ripe for judgment and send it back, so they have to go through the appeal. And at that point, when we're doing an appeal, we have, you're dealing with human beings, we have an opportunity to resolve any issues that need to be resolved and do it in a more amicable way. So yes, I think we should have an appeals process, but I do believe it should be in the guidebook as opposed to regulation.
Any other thoughts?
This is Commissioner Lee. I don't disagree with that, Commissioner Jackson. I just don't know where the line is drawn. What is in a regulation and what is in the guidebook? That's kind of what I'm a little unclear on. I know the appeals process was something that was big on our last issue that we had, was the appeals process. So I don't care where it goes, but I know that it needs to be addressed somewhere. But I just don't know who and where the line is drawn between the guidebook and regulation. I'm not clear on that.
We're the same people that have the contracts. They would probably have an idea.
They would.
Let's do some research and bring it to a workshop. All right. I don't really have anything else. Do any of the other commissioners, or anything that, as we went through this, that now has come up in your mind you want to revisit for a minute before we go to public comment?
The only thing I would revisit or give some people a chance to think about is we refer to the scoring committee. I think we should rename it the funding committee, because that's what it actually is a funding committee, as opposed to a scoring committee. But that would be my only comment.
You're talking about the grants committee?
Yeah. Refer to as
I think you just had called it a new name, the scoring committee, as opposed to the grants committee.
it says in the scoring.
Okay.
Charlie, John Griggs.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Go ahead, finish your thought. I'm on a different track.
No, you can go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to that, what I talked about for non-eligible cost, and get it on the record so that we could workshop it. And I'll give you some language, or I can send you some language later, whichever you prefer, about asset purchases.
Yeah, I think if you could just send that to me, because all of this there's been a lot of suggestions made, so we'll have a new starting point for the workshop.
Okay, I'll do it.
And then, I guess, Kim, have you been able to keep track of all of these changes?
Yes, I've made my notes.
Okay. So then I guess I'm going to assume that, or maybe I shouldn't assume. So will you reproduce these documents with the changes and post them so that we have a starting point for the workshop?
I was going to communicate with you after the meeting how you wanted me, if you wanted me to make adjustments to the documentations, or how you wanted me to do that.
Okay, well, I guess we'll chat after the meeting. Is there any public comment?
John Griggs.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say I'd like to thank the camera operators at both locations for this meeting and last one. It's nice to have that, and you gentlemen are much more attractive than I had you pictured.
I wish we could say the same, Paul Jacks, for the record. I'd like to thank Mr. Cox. I know this is the first time he's been running a committee of the commission, and I think he did a really good job for his first time out, and I'd like to congratulate him and thank him for running a good meeting and keeping us on time. Thank you.
You're welcome. So I take it there's no public comment from Carson?
There is one, yes.
This is
Okay.
Scott Gers with the Nevada Trail Stewards. I would like to second Mr. Jackson's notice there and thank Charlie for running a good meeting and keeping things on track here. And thank you for the opportunity from the OHV community to attend these types of meetings. And we're all looking forward to the workshop. A little piece of business that we were talking about earlier via email was apparently there were quite a few interested parties that didn't receive notification of the meeting, and we want to make sure that that's addressed for future issues. And I'd like to suggest maybe the ability, it's nice that the LCB has the live feed going out on the internet on their site, and I know that several other committees and organizations use a internet format where the public can actually contact the commission via a email or a live text session, so possibly the secretary could field those and they could be involved in more public comment from remote locations, since it's difficult for much of the public to make it to either Carson or the Grant Sawyer building. So thank you again for your time. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. Is there any more public comment?
Paul Jackson for the record. We've actually already looked into doing email responses and doing some things from the public, and it's actually going to be an agenda item on our May 15th meeting already. Thank you.
Gary Lambert for the record. I know that there had been recent talk about having a phone line in place by now, and a matter of fact, it was promised a couple meetings ago. I hope we follow up on that telephone conference line. I know it requires us setting up a government billing line with AT&T, and it seems like that would fall under our discretionary money that the budget allowed the chair to spend. I encourage us to set that line up so that we can have a telephone line that's not $1 something a minute, but pennies a minute for the public. It is hugely important that the rural community be involved with OHV. Thank you.
If I may address this is Paul Jackson for the record. I don't remember, and perhaps somebody can refresh me in writing, with when that was promised. I know the subject was brought up in public comment, and at the time there was no such representations or promises made that there would be a public line. For us to have a public line where somebody is calling in, we'd actually have to have an operator being able to distinguish the lines and then bring them in on public comment. Though I want to encourage as much public comment as we can. We can't get ridiculous with this thing and end up costing us more money than we're spending on grants. I think that the solution that we're working on now is more than reasonable, where people can view the meetings via the internet and would be able to email in their comments to be read into public comment. And I think that's as reasonable as we can get. We have 3 locations throughout the state. We happen to be in a state that's very spread out. States like California have similar situations, and they, again, only have 3 locations. So, again, for those people who would like to be involved, I think that the best solution is going to be being able to do this by email, which will be read into public comment. Thank you.
Gary Lambert for the record. I followed up on this a couple weeks ago with the Publications Department. It's evident that if we acquire a phone line under a government phone line and institute conference calling, it does not take an operator to do this. Normal conference calling procedures fall into place. I encourage us to follow through with what we have earlier started. Thank you.
Okay, this is Mr. Cox. I had to keep us on track. And obviously this is not an agendized item. However, I think that's something that can be put on the agenda for the next meeting, the next commission meeting, and hopefully we have some hard and fast facts and rules, and those of you who have a burden for it on your hearts can follow through, and it would be wonderful if we could have something like that, but this is not the place to discuss it. So if there's no more public comment, I'm going to adjourn this meeting.
Move to adjourn.
And seconded by
second.
McKay.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, any opposed? Thank you, gentlemen. I think this has been helpful. I look forward to the workshop.